You've tuned in to the unavailing frequency. But don't touch that dial. We've got you right where we want you.
This is Lineage of the Damned, Part 2, The Gaze of the Abyss. I turned my head and looked the entity directly in the eyes, or rather, where its eyes should have been. The moment my direct line of sight locked onto the space it occupied, the attic ceased to exist. The heavy Webley revolver in my hand, the dusty floorboards, the single swinging light bulb, they were all stripped away in a violent, silent implosion of reality. It was as if a canvas had been violently ripped open, pulling me through the tear into the suffocating dark behind the painting of the world. My finger had already squeezed the heavy iron trigger. I heard the deafening crack of the gunshot, felt the violent recoil snap in my wrist, but the sound was instantly swallowed by an immense, crushing silence. The bullet never reached its target. I watched, suspended in a void of impossible geometry, as the lead projectile simply stopped in midair, caught in the thick, gelatinous atmosphere of the entity's domain. It hung there, spinning lazily, cooling from silver to dull gray. Time did not function here. I was no longer in the attic. I was nowhere and everywhere. When I finally perceived the entity head-on, my mind fractured, attempting to process the sensory input of a creature that defied three-dimensional space. It was not a shadow. It was not a shifting, kaleidoscopic architecture of shattered glass and dying light. It folded inward on itself in a continuous, agonizing loop, a tesseract of pure, ancient malice. At its center, burning with the cold intensity of a dead star, was the gaze. It wasn't an eye. It was a focal point of awareness that pinned my consciousness to the void like a butterfly on a mounting board. "Flesh of Elliot," a voice echoed, though it was not a voice. It was a frequency that vibrated in the marrow of my bones, a psychic weight that tasted of rusted iron and millennia of starvation. "Flesh of Silas, flesh of Arthur, flesh of Jesse." It was tasting my lineage. It was parsing through my DNA, savoring the generations of terror it had cultivated. I had tried to scream, but I had no lungs in this place. I tried to move, but I had no body. I was nothing but raw, exposed consciousness, dangling before the maw of a cosmic predator. "You offer yourself to the void," the frequency rumbled, amused. "You think the cessation of your heartbeat starves the famine. You are mistaken. Death is not an escape. Death is the harvest." The entity shifted, an avalanche of broken angles and shifting shadows, and suddenly the void ripped open again and I was falling. I hit the ground hard. The impact knocked the wind out of me. I had lungs again, a body again. I gasped, choking on the air that tasted of sulfur, cordite, and rotting earth. It was pitch black. The space was incredibly cramped. The walls pressing in on me were wet, slick, and freezing cold. Mud. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, my fingers sinking deep into the viscous, freezing slurry. Above me, the earth shook with a concussive roar that vibrated through my teeth. Artillery. I was in the Ypres salient. I was in 1917. Through the darkness, a faint, flickering amber glow appeared. A man was crawling toward me through the narrow tunnel, holding a sputtering trench lantern. He wore a mud-caked wool uniform, his face smeared with clay, his eyes wide and brilliant with an intelligence I recognized immediately. Elliot, my great-grandfather. He didn't see me, or rather, he looked right through me. I was a phantom, a forced observer in a memory etched into the bloodline. "Thomas! Miller!" He shouted over the distant thunder of the shells, his voice cracked with panic. "Answer me, damn you!" I followed him. I had no choice. My feet moved on their own, trailing behind him as he crawled to the end of the earthen tunnel. We reached the breach he had described in his journal, a jagged hole torn through the clay, leading into a space that shouldn't exist between the battlefields of Europe. Elliot held his lantern up, thrusting it through the opening. I leaned over his shoulder, peering into the cavern. The walls were exactly as he had described, glassy, obsidian smooth, angled in ways that made my eyes water and my stomach heave. It was a pocket of an alien reality buried beneath the mud of France. In the center of the cavern lay Thomas and Miller. They were dead, but not by any human weapon. Their bodies were twisted, folded into themselves like origami, their limbs jutting out at impossible angles, their faces frozen in expressions of terror so profound their jaws had dislocated. And standing over them was the entity. It looked different here in its physical anchor point. It was denser, more substantial. It had not yet fed on 80 years of human fear. It was hungry. I watched as the entity's formless head turned toward the breach. It locked onto Elliot. I felt the psychic snap. It was a physical tether, a cord of dark, vibrating energy that lashed out from the enemy and buried itself deep into Elliot's chest. Elliot dropped the lantern, a choke scream dying in his throat, and he scrambled backwards into the mud. "The anchor is cast," the cosmic voice whispered in my mind, drawing out the artillery shells. "The seed is planted in the blood." The memory dissolved into ash, blowing away into the void. And I was falling again. But this time I landed in a seating position. The smell of mud was replaced by the scent of stale cigarette smoke, damp upholstery, and cheap gasoline. Rain lashed across the glass, the rhythmic thump-thump of windshield wipers struggling against a torrential downpour. I was in the passenger seat of a heavy, still-bodied 1950 sedan. Behind the wheel sat a man in his early 30s. He had my father's jawline in my eyes. Silas Nolan, my grandfather. His knuckles were white as he gripped the thin steering wheel. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving with shallow, panic breaths. He kept his eyes locked dead ahead on the rain-slicked highway, the high beams cutting through the absolute darkness of a rural country road. "Just keep looking forward, just keep looking forward," Silas muttered to himself in a frantic mantra. I looked at the rearview mirror. The back seat was not empty. The entity sat behind him, a massive towering column of static and shadow that pressed against the roof of the car. It was larger than it had been in 1917. It had fed on Elliot's madness until his death in the asylum, and now it was feeding on Silas. It wasn't doing anything, it was just there, projecting a suffocating wave of dread that filled the cabin. Silas reached a trembling hand forward to adjust the radio, desperate for noise, for distraction. In doing so, his eyes darted for a fraction of a second into the rearview mirror. And he saw it. The entity surged forward, not physically, but psychically. The sheer weight of its presence slammed into Silence's mind. He screamed, a raw primal sound of absolute devastation. He yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, desperately trying to swerve away from the thing that was already inside the car with him. The heavy sedan violently veered off the asphalt. The headlights illuminated the massive trunk of an ancient elm tree for a split second before the impact. The sound of crunching metal and shattering glass was deafening. But as the memory froze at the exact millisecond of Silas's death, the entity did not die with him. I watched in horrific fascination as the dark tether, the cord of vibrating energy I had seen attached to Elliot, snapped clearly from Silas's chest as his heart stopped. It hovered in the air for a moment, like a blind worm searching for a host, before whipping through the air and vanishing into the night. It was traveling to the next blood link. It was traveling to a young boy asleep in a suburban bedroom, entirely unaware that his father had just died and that his inheritance was already on its way. "They flee into the dark," the entity mocked, its voice echoing in the crushed cabin of the car. "They offer their lives to escape the gaze, but the tether remains unbroken." The wrecked car melted into shadows and the environment reconstructed itself again. I was standing in the hallway of my father's house. It was not the dusty, abandoned tomb I had visited a few days ago. It was alive, but still suffocating. The year was 2023. My father, Arthur Nolan, was standing at the end of the hall. He looked 20 years older than he actually was. His hair was completely white, his skin a sickly jaundice yellow hanging off his cheekbones. He was holding a staple gun and a roll of heavy black construction paper. He was sealing himself in. I watched as my father stapled the paper over the small window in the front door. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Each staple driven by frantic, desperate energy. "Can't see it if there's no reflection," Arthur mumbled, a line of saliva trailing from the corner of his cracked lips. "Can't let it catch me. It's in the corners. The geometry's all wrong. God, the geometry." He turned around, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and completely feral. He walked right past me, oblivious to my presence. I looked into the living room, and the entity was there. It was gargantuan now. It filled the entire corner of the room, its fractal edges scraping against the popcorn ceiling. It was no longer waiting in the periphery. It was aggressively encroaching on the center of the room. It was practically vibrating with anticipation, gorging itself on Arthur's total psychological collapse. My father dropped the staple gun and collapsed into a ragged armchair. He pulled his knees to his chest, rocking back and forth. "Just close your eyes," Arthur whispered, tears streaming down his hollow cheeks. "Just close your eyes, Artie. If you don't look, it can't take you. If you don't look." He squeezed his eyes shut with a grimace of pure agony. He clamped his hands over his ears. He curled into a tight fetal ball, trying to reduce his existence to the smallest possible point in space. And he stayed like that for hours. And the memory time compressed. I watched the sun rise and set outside the blackened windows. I watched my father waste away in that chair, refusing to open his eyes, refusing to eat, refusing to drink. He was starving himself to death, just like Elliot had done in the asylum. He thought he was winning. He thought by denying its gaze that he was starving the entity. But as I looked at the towering mass of cosmic horror looming over his chair, I realized the horrifying truth. The entity wasn't starving, it was feasting. The slow, agonizing torment of Arthur's self-imposed sensory deprivation was the most exquisite meal it had ever consumed. When Arthur's heart finally gave out, a massive, silent cessation of life in the dead of night, the dark tether snapped from his chest. It whipped through the air, vibrating with immense, terrifying power, and shot directly towards me. The memory shattered. I was violently ripped back into the void, floating in the boundless expanse of shattered glass and dead stars. The entity hovered before me, magnificent and terrible. The bullet from my Webley was still suspended in the air between us. "You have seen the chain," the entity communicated, its frequency smug, satiated. "You have seen the cattle march to the slaughter. Elliot, Silas, Arthur, and now Jesse. You raised the iron to your temple to end it. You thought to cheat me." It shifted, its geometry folding closer, filling my entire field of consciousness. "Pull the trigger, Jesse Nolan. Shatter your skull. It will merely sever the tether of the flesh. Since there is no offspring to inherit the anchor, your consciousness will remain here, with me, in the dark, for eternity. You will not die. You will simply become an endless feast." The realization crashed over me like a wave of ice water. Ending myself was exactly what I wanted. If I did that now, the tether had nowhere to go. Without a blood relative to anchor to the physical world, my soul, my consciousness, would be permanently dragged into this dimension. I would be trapped with it forever, a battery of eternal terror. The gun was a trap. The despair was a trap. I looked at the suspended bullet. I looked at the towering cosmic horror before me. And then I laughed. It started as a low chuckle, bubbling up from a place of pure exhausted absurdity, and quickly erupted in a full-throat maniacal laugh. The entity recoiled, the chaotic folding of its geometry slowed. For the first time since 1917, the creature registered something it did not understand. "Why do you vibrate with this frequency?" it demanded, the psychic weight turning jagged and confused. "This is not terror." You're an idiot, I said, my voice echoed in the void, remaining remarkably calm, devoid of shaking panic that had defined the last few weeks of my life. You're an ancient cosmic god, and you're an absolute idiot. I reached out my incorporeal hand, grasping the heavy Webley revolver suspended in the void. "You feed on fear," I said, staring directly into the focal point of its gaze. "You feed on the desperation of men trying to escape you." Elliot ran, Silas ran, my father hid. They gave you exactly what you wanted. They gave you their dread. They gave you their minds. I pointed the gun away from my own head. "But I know your secret now. You're a parasite, and a parasite needs a host to react. If the host doesn't care, the parasite starves." I didn't aim the gun at the entity. You can't shoot a god of the void. You can't kill a concept. Instead, I lowered the gun completely. I let it drop from my hand and into the endless dark. "I'm not going to kill myself," I told it, my voice ringing with an iron absolute. "I'm not going to let you drag me into this place forever. I'm not going to give you another ounce of fear." The entity surged forward, towering over me, a tidal wave of psychic pressure threatening to crush my mind. It projected images of madness, of eternal suffering, of the agonizing deaths of my ancestors. It screamed in its silent frequency, trying to force the terror back into my veins. But I simply stood there. I looked at the impossible geometry, the shattered glass, the dead stars. "Is that it?" I forced a tone of utter boredom. "This all you got? Peripheral shadows and a superiority complex?" I took a deep breath, marshaling every ounce of impower that I possessed. I visualized the door closing in my mind. I locked away the grief for my father. I locked away the horror of the trenches. I locked away the instinctual biological primate fear of the dark, and I replaced it with the apathy, a cold, heavy, immovable stone of absolute indifference. "I'm going home now," I said. "You cannot leave!" The entity roared, a sound like tearing metal. "The tether binds you!" "The tether binds us," I corrected. "You're anchored to my blood, which means you're stuck with me. I'm the one driving." I closed my eyes, not in fear like my father, but in dismissal. I rejected the void. I rejected this entity's domain. I focused on the feeling of the dusty floorboards beneath my feet, the smell of mildew, the cold air of the attic. The psychic pressure reached a critical mass, a shrieking crescendo of denied hunger. The void violently vibrated, fighting to keep me unmoored, but it couldn't. It only had power when I engaged with it, when I feared it. By rendering it irrelevant, I stripped it of all its leverage. With a sound like a thunderclap, reality slammed back into place. I opened my eyes. I was back in the attic. I was on my knees, gasping for breath. The single light bulb swung gently overhead. The Webley revolver lay on the floorboard a few feet away, a thin curl of smoke rising from the barrel. There was a bullet hole in the roof of the attic right above my head. I must have jerked my hand at the last possible millisecond before my consciousness was pulled into the void. I stayed on my knees for a long time, listening to the rain begin to fall on the shingles above. My heart was beating a steady, normal rhythm. My hands were perfectly still. I slowly stood up. I brushed the dust off my jeans. I walked over to Elliot's trunk, picked up the journal, and placed it inside. I closed the lid. I picked up the revolver, checked the cylinder, and placed it carefully on top of the trunk. I wouldn't be needing it. As I turned to walk toward the attic stairs, I felt it. The familiar drop in air pressure, the metallic odor, the heavy, suffocating presence hovering just outside my peripheral vision, lingering near the rafters. It had returned with me. It was still tethered, but it felt different. It didn't feel vast and malignant anymore. It felt diminished, desperate even. It shifted and writhed in the corner of my eye, practically belonging and begging for me to turn, begging for me to acknowledge it, begging for a morsel of fear. I paused at the top of the stairs. Well, I've got to go to work on Monday, I said to the empty air. I'm going to make a pot of coffee. I'm going to go sit at my desk. And I'm going to look at spreadsheets. You want to stand in the corner and watch? Knock yourself out. The entity vibrated the silent hiss of frustrated malice. But you understand this. I continued, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. You get nothing else from me. I will not tape the windows. I will not avoid mirrors. I'm going to live a long, incredibly boring, aggressively mundane life. I will never marry. I will never have children. The Nolan bloodline ends with me. And when I finally die of old age decades from now, you will have starved to death long before I do. And I didn't wait for a response. I didn't turn my head to look at it. I simply walked down the stairs, turned off the attic light, and closed the door behind me. That was 3 years ago. I still live in my apartment. I went back to my job as a data analyst. I started seeing my friends again. Sometimes I even go to the movies. But it is always there. Right now, as I type this, it is standing to my left. It is hovering near the bookshelf, a tall, shifting mass of impossible geometry. It constantly tries new tactics. Sometimes it projects the smell of rotting meat. Sometimes it makes the temperature in the room drop below freezing. Sometimes it leans in so close I can feel the static electricity crackling against the hair on my arm. But I never look. I never acknowledge it. I just keep my eyes on the screen and keep typing. It's a grueling existence, I won't lie about that. It takes an immense amount of energy to maintain a state of perpetual enforced apathy. There are nights when the exhaustion is so deep I just want to scream. There are moments when the primal fear threatens to bubble up, urging me to just turn my head and get it over with. But then I remember my father, dying alone in a taped-up house. I remember Elliot in the mud, Silas out in the rain, and the apathy turns into a cold, hardened spite. The entity is getting weaker, I can tell. The peripheral shadow is less distinct now. The scent, fainter. It is starving. It is tethered to a host that refuses to feed it, trapped in a physical world it despises, slowly withering away as I outlast it. We're locked in a stalemate, a war of attrition that will last until the day I die. I am Jesse Nolan. I am the last of my bloodline, and I am winning.